Now, South Africa is moving into altered rainfall events, but this has little impact on water security in cities where taps are running dry. This is all according to the water resource management expert, Professor Anthony Turton. His expert comments follow the heavy downpours in most parts of the country, which have led to dams filling to capacity, but this may not make a difference in addressing water challenges faced by many residents. For more on this, we're joined by Professor Anthony Turton, who's a water expert. A very good evening to you, Professor. Thank you so much for your time. The intensity of each rainfall has been massive, but still, the city's taps are going to run dry. What do you mean by this? How does this happen?
Yes, good evening to you and the listeners. Having water in a river or dam is one matter. Taking it from the river and dam and putting it through a processing plant, cleaning it up, storing it, pumping it, metering it, selling it, and eventually delivering it to every single end user, and then collecting it as waste and putting it back in through a water treatment plant back into the river is a very complicated process. So that entire value chain is something that is dependent on institutions, and in fact mostly municipal institutions, although in some cases there are also SOEs such as water boards. So while the municipalities are generally not always in good nick at the moment, that's the problem. We have growing demand for water on the one hand, but we have the lack of institutional capacity to predict and to plan for the future, and therefore we can't translate the surface water we have in the river to a shortage of water in the towns and cities.
Planning for the future, how serious of a problem will this present to coastal cities like the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape? How critical and serious is the crisis leading up to the different years?
Well, the National Water Resource Strategy #1, which came out in 2002, was the first very high confidence study ever done in terms of the National Water Act. And it indicated at that stage that we had already allocated 98% of all the water we have the country. And more importantly, it also made it very clear that every single coastal city has got a major problem, because the water for those coastal cities has mostly been used by inland users. So there's no question about that. From Richards Bay down to Durban, down to East London, Port Elizabeth, all the way through to Cape Town, all of those cities have got very, very finite limitations to the economic growth. However, having said that, there are major changes taking place in the technology of desalination and the economics of desalination, and I've got very, very little doubt that this is going to become an increasingly important part in the economic mix for the future of all of our coastal cities.
So in the absence of long-term planning and the unregulated inward migration of people that really has now overloaded the system, what are the recommendations, looking at where the cities are heading?
Well, we first have to stabilize the existing system, and the system is so broken right now. I talk about the infrastructure itself. We're all concerned about Eskom, but very few people really worry too much about the water system. But in reality, the water system is as damaged, if not more damaged, than the electrical infrastructure. Conservative indications are that we need just short of 1 trillion rand simply to fix what is broken. That's not upgrading, that's not expanding, that's just to fix what is broken. And of course, we all know that the fiscus is unable to do that. We are losing taxpayers at an alarming rate, and the tax base in the country is shrinking. So we have got a serious problem there. But the first thing we have to do is we have to recognize that there is a problem. And then the second thing is we've got to get some political stability. We've got to get stability at the leadership of your municipal level. The political parties have to stop infighting and stop squabbling about who's going to get what portfolio, because that instability then translates down to the institutions below them. And then we need to rebuild those institutions with technically competent people, capable of doing long-term forecasts. And when I talk about long-term forecasts, it's important to note that from the time that a decision is made to expand water supply in an area till the time that you can open the taps and have more water coming out of it is approximately a decade, 10 years. So the long-term planning cycles could be as much as 25 years in advance. So this is not a short-term fix at all. It's a very technical issue. We need to let the technical people get involved, encumbered by the political shenanigans that's going on.
So how then do you gauge the impact of the weather patterns on water security?
Well, that's obviously a factor, without any question of doubt, but that is a technical issue. And the only way we can buffer ourselves from, let's call it, the vagaries of nature is by upgrading our infrastructure and making our infrastructure appropriate, or what is known as fit for purpose. At the moment, the infrastructure that we have is no longer fit for purpose. It was designed for environmental factors that were relevant 50 years ago, half a century ago. Those environmental factors have changed. We have now got completely different rainfall cycles, different intensities of rain. And this, just that one sentence I've said now has got severe implications for people, because many houses and lots of infrastructure has been built below the 50-year flood line or on the 50-year flood line. And we might actually have to start moving things away to a 100-year, maybe even a 250-year flood line, given the change in the intensity of events. These are engineering-related problems, best left to the engineers, but they all have got some severe financial and social and political implications. So we've really got to get our heads around this thing in advance.
And looking at the small but perhaps practical alternatives, like, for instance, boreholes, would that be another option to perhaps, avert the massive water crisis that is being faced by cities?
Boreholes have got a role to play, but you must remember that the National Water Act has nationalised all water, so all water belongs to the state. So the individual doesn't necessarily have a right to go and just drill a borehole in their backyard. They might do it, but it's probably an illegal venture. And if you are using a borehole, for example, in a body corporate or something like that, to start supplying water to a gated community or to a sectional title scheme, then you become a water services provider, which has also got legal implications that are quite complex. So yes, boreholes can make a difference, but in general, the geology in South Africa is not always conducive to a high yield borehole. But of course, it depends on where you're physically located. The boreholes are highly nuanced things. You could have a good borehole here and a bad borehole just 100 meters away. So it's one of those things that's not uniform.
Yeah. And what would determine the two differences in the boreholes?
Well, it's all about the underlying geology. And, if you look at South Africa, about 60% of our economic activity takes place in the hinterland. And by virtue of the geography of the country, that hinterland also happens to be mostly a granitic, a granite substrate. And granite, hard rock granite, generally is not conducive to high yield water, high yield aquifers. However, having said that, we have got dolomite in large parts of the country. In fact, we've got one of the largest dolomitic aquifers in the world is actually in South Africa. So we do have water in the dolomite areas, but that's also complex, because if you abstract too much water from a dolomitic aquifer, then you start getting ground instability issues and sinkholes and stuff like that. So when you get to groundwater, you start getting to a different level of complexity that demand a different kind of solution.
Very well. Thank you so much. Thanks for weighing in on this discussion. That was water resource management expert, Professor Anthony Turton.